Welcome, everyone. Today we are going to cover the topic of tissues. When we talk about tissues, we will be mentioning epithelium, connective tissue, muscle tissue, and nerve tissue. The term epithelia and epithelium are interchangeable. Epithelia and connective tissue are two larger topics that we'll cover. Muscle and nerve, not so big. So let's look at the four different types of tissue. And remember, what is it that makes up tissues? What we spoke about in our first lecture is that we have a group of cells that come together, and the group of cells make up tissues. Now, tissues have distinctive structures, they have distinctive patterns. So when we look at structure and patterns, to me, this is form and function. So again, structure determines function. We can see that at the cellular level, and we can see it at the tissue level. We can see it at the organ level. So when these tissues come together, they themselves will organize to form organs, such as the heart, the kidneys, and the lungs. When we study tissues, we call that histology. Remember, when we studied cells, we call them cytology. An individual who studies tissues is typically referred to as a histologist. For example, when you go for a biopsy, it's going to a histologist. When a woman goes to the gynecologist and goes for a pap smear, they are sloughing off cells and tissues of the vaginal wall and the uterus, and they're analyzing it under a microscope. That's going to a histologist. Sometimes they're even referred to as a pathologist or a histopathologist. PAP, a lot of people don't know this, but PAP is the abbreviation for the physician who came up with the test, who was a Greek gentleman by the name of George Papanicolaou. So they took that Greek name, right? It's all Greek to me. I can say that because my wife is Greek, right? George Papanicolaou, and they took that large Greek name and abbreviated it to PAP, the PAP smear. So epithelium. So when I think of epithelium, one of the first things I think of is the skin, or at least the upper surface of the skin, called the epidermis, because epithelium is the type of tissue that's involved with covering and lining the body. Not only does it cover the external surface of the body, but it's also involved in lining the body cavities. We spoke about cavities in our first lecture. It's also lining tubules. Well, what word do we see here in tubules? We see tubes. So the body is a tube within a tube, meaning there are a bunch of tubular structures inside the body, whether we call it the digestive system. It's a tube. We got the esophagus, we have the stomach, small and large intestine, just a bunch of tubes. We have arteries and veins, again, just a bunch of long tubes. We have the reproductive tract, it's a tube. The respiratory tract, it's another tube. So I want you to think of the systems, many of the systems in the body, even the urinary tract would be synonymous with tubes. So we're going to find a lot of epithelium within the tubular system. We also have glands, like sweat glands and oil glands and mammary glands, right? These are classified as epithelium because they develop from epithelium membranes. Now, some of the functions of epithelium, well, if we think of the skin, we can say, well, it protects us, right, against any chemical damage or against bacterial invasion or friction. The skin can act as a major form of protection, almost would be synonymous with with the cell membrane or the plasma membrane. It would be the wall that keeps whatever is extracellular or outside of the cell, keeps it on the outside, and keeps what's intracellular inside the cell, it keeps it inside. The pH of what's inside is different than the pH of what's outside. So epithelium serves the primary purpose of protecting us. There's also cilia that we can find on epithelium. We see the cilia on the respiratory tract, especially within the windpipe, like along the trachea. I will show you an image, not in a pretty short time frame, where I will show you within the respiratory tract, especially in the trachea, where we have a type of epithelium called pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium. Well, that was a mouthful, wasn't it? I'll say that again. Pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium. There's a lot of words there that are descriptive. And after I go through a lot of those terms, it won't sound so foreign to you. You'll feel comfortable with it. But cilia, especially in the respiratory tract, they're sweeping up dust. They're beating rhythmically from inferior to superior to make sure that if there's any foreign particles that are getting into the airway, it beats it upward, keeping it away from the lungs so that eventually you can go, right, and cough it up and out. Epithelium is also used for absorption, especially in the digestive tract, like the stomach and the small intestine. It allows us to absorb nutrients. Very, very important. In terms of filtration, when I think of filtration, I think of filters and I think of the kidneys. A lot of all the blood is going through the liver and the kidneys for filtering. And whatever the body doesn't want, it will excrete it out of the body. Whatever it wants, it will reabsorb it back into the body. So filtration at the level of the kidney is really important. There's a degree of absorption that takes place there, and there's a degree of secretion that takes there, as well as excretion. When I think of secretion, we see the word secrete, I think of glands, right? Glands can secrete substances, but the kidneys also secrete substances. When you get into the kidney and the urinary tract, then you learn all about the nephron, and you also get into the cardiac or cardiovascular system. You will learn how important the kidneys are, especially in regulating blood pressure. There is a system called the RAS system, which stands for renin, aldosterone, angiotensin system. I will touch upon that a little bit when we get into endocrinology during our 4th week together. Sensory reception. The epithelium covers the body surfaces and it contains a lot of sensory receptors or sensory organs. The cilia and microvilli are very, very similar. Cilia are long, slender extensions, whereas microvilli, there's the word micro, meaning much smaller projections. The cilia are long extensions that come off the plasma membrane, whereas microvilli are smaller projections off the plasma membrane. The cilia help to move secretions and fluids across the cell surface. Microvilli are involved with increasing absorption. So there are going to be lots of microvilli on the intestines, especially, because we're going to need to absorb a lot of nutrients. We know in many people who may have issues, let's say with gluten or gluten intolerance or have celiac disease, the gluten destroy the microvilli within the intestines. And when you break down the microvilli, you'll end up with a lot of malabsorption diseases because that individual cannot absorb vital nutrients from food. So they have a lot of malabsorptive diseases. All right, we're still talking about epithelium. And when we look at epithelium, we have to be able to identify it and name it. So we name epithelium by 2 ways. Number one, the number of layers that we see, and then the shape of the cells. So if we look at the shape of the cells, they come in three flavors, right? Squamous, cuboidal, and columnar. Cuboidal sounds like cube, and it is. It looks like a box. Columnar sounds like a column, and it is. It looks like a building or a rectangle. And squamous, you're going to see this word not only in relationship to epithelium, but we will see squamous when I show you osteology. There is a squamous suture when we look at the skull, and it happens to have a similar shape to the squamous cell, which really means flat and irregular shaped. So we have to look at the shape of the cells, which gives us part of the name, and then we look at how many layers we see of those cells. If we see only one layer, then we call it simple squamous epithelium. If we see more than one layer, we call it stratified squamous epithelium, or simple cuboidal epithelium, or stratified cuboidal epithelium. And we're looking at the number of layers at the top surface, or the apical layer, right? The apex, the layer that's at the top. So let's take a look here, and let's look at the middle here where it says simple cuboidal, right? We could see a bunch of nuclei here in the center of the cell. We see that the cells look square or cube shaped. Remember the terms were squamous, cuboidal, and columnar. So if it's only one cell layer thick, as this is, we call it simple cuboidal epithelium. But down below, we see that it's more than one cell layer, so we call it stratified cuboidal, right? Here's one layer, here's two. Notice the nuclei are very centrally located. So now we apply this concept to both squamous. Let's look here. We see one cell layer thick of these flat, irregular shaped cells, simple squamous. But here's the basement layer, and up here is the apical surface. So we see about 1, 2, 3, 4, maybe about 5 layers of those squamous cells. So we'll call it stratified squamous epithelium. Now, let's think of basic concept here. If we see something that is one cell layer, like simple squamous, and this is a very thin layer, this is much thinner than the cuboidal. Would you agree? Of course. So squamous, the simple squamous, is very good for diffusion, right? For things and solutes and liquids and stuff to passively move through this membrane. But if we have something that's, let's say, stratified squamous, and we have something that's multiple cell layers thick, this is good for, let's say, there's a chemical spill, or let's say an abrasion or friction or mechanical abrasions. So we're going to see simple squamous. This would be good if you had it on the epidermis of the skin. And it just so happens we do. The top layer of skin happens to have 25 or 30 layers of the stratified squamous epithelium. Now here, the simple cuboidal, this is found in the kidneys, where we have the kidney tubules. That's simple cuboidal. Now look at columnar. This is one cell layer thick. These are just much, larger than the cubes. The columns are taller. The nuclei are still centrally located. So we call this simple columnar epithelium. Now look below that. If you look at the nuclei here, it looks like there's multiple levels. It looks like it's multiple levels, but it's really not multiple levels. And because it looks like it's multiple, but it's really not, we use the word pseudo, which means false. So we call this pseudostratified, right? Stratified is multiple layers. But with columnar, we typically get something called pseudostratified, which is falsely stratified. And the reason why it looks that way is this is one layer. This is one layer. It's smaller, one layer, one layer. It's just that the nuclei are scattered at different levels, so it gives it the appearance that it really is stratified, but it's not. Then we have transitional epithelium. And the way I want you to visualize transitional is that if you think of a balloon, Okay, let's say it's a deflated balloon, and you were to draw with a marker, let's say a circle or a square or a rectangle, any shape for that matter, and you draw it while it's deflated. What happens to the shape of that when you blow up the balloon? Doesn't it distort? Doesn't it become modified? Doesn't it become stretched? So wherever we have organs that can increase and decrease their shape, let's say the urinary bladder that can increase in size or decrease in size depending on how much urine it's storing, the cells can stretch and alter in shape. So we call that transitional epithelium. Now, the other thing that's really unique about epithelium is that I want you to see how closely packed these cells are to one another. These cells are very closely packed with very, very little extracellular matrix or extracellular substances. These cells are tightly woven or tightly packed together due to these maybe tight junctions or gap junctions or desmosomes, right? Cells are held together by cell junctions, and there's a variety of junctions that hold them together. Your book talks about tight junctions. We'll see them especially in the stomach and the bladder and the intestines. It talks about gap junctions, which we'll talk about with the heart and neurons. And then there's desmosomes and hemidesmosomes that we'll see and found in the skin. So when we see a bunch of cells held closely together like we do here in all of these examples, that is classical of epithelium, because connective tissue, which is the second type of tissue that we'll get into, looks very, very different than what we see here. Connective tissue is when you have cells that are not closely packed together. In fact, they're spread far apart from one another, and it has lots of extracellular matrix. So that's one of the key differentials between epithelium and connective, is epithelium has cells closely bound together with little extracellular matrix, whereas connective tissue has cells that are scattered farther apart and have lots of extracellular matrix. Classical example of that would be blood, for example. If you were to look at a blood smear, you have red blood cells and white blood cells, and they're scattered very, they're not closely bound to each other like we see here. And then the plasma would be the extracellular matrix. That's what the blood cells are suspended in. So again, we have simple epithelium or stratified epithelium. And again, we can have simple squamous, simple cuboidal, and simple columnar. The squamous cells are great for protection and diffusion, whereas the cuboidal cells are really important for absorption and secretion. So that term pseudostratified that I mentioned before, that was when we saw the nuclei that were lying at different levels. And it gave that false appearance of being stratified, and it was called pseudostratified. Many times where we find pseudostratified, we'll also see cilia hanging off of that, especially in the trachea, where we have pseudostratified, ciliated, columnar epithelium. And when people smoke, it paralyzes the cilia. It just kills them off, so that we don't have anything beating rhythmically from inferior to superior to trap the debris. So all the chemicals and all the foreign particles make it deep into the lungs, and that becomes a problem. The transitional epithelium, it's a type of stratified squamous, but they start to modify and change their shape depending on the organ, like the urinary bladder and the ureters and parts of the urethra. They can certainly alter in their shape. They can start out as flat, and then when the organ is full, they become round, right? And then when it's empty, it changes its shape again. So I think of the urinary bladder when it comes to that. So under simple epithelium, there's simple squamous, simple cuboidal, simple columnar. And under stratified epithelium, there's stratified squamous, stratified cuboidal, stratified columnar, pseudostratified columnar, and then our transitional epithelium. So this has shown up in the past on one of the quizzes from one of my past cohorts, and you have to kind of drag these terms to the description. So let's see if we can figure this out. So if there was a blank here, it would say, okay, this type of epithelium can function in diffusion, filtration, secretion, and protection. Well, simple squamous, it's one cell layer thick, is good for filtering and for diffusion. Things can pass through one cell layer thick. When we talk about simple cuboidal, this is good for absorption, secretion, and protection. We'll find these along the kidney tubules, especially the proximal and distal convoluted tubules. You will see those terms, distal and proximal convoluted tubule, under a topic called the nephron. The nephron happens to be the functional unit of the kidneys. Stratified squamous. Okay, so now we're not talking about simple, we're talking about many layers of that. Well, that's for protection of the underlying layers, so this would be important, especially with the skin, like the epidermis. Pseudostratified columnar. Well, this is the one that sometimes has cilia that's on it, and this is important for movement of secretions like mucus across the apex or the apical surface of the tissue. So this means that, let's say we were talking about the trachea, where we have pseudostratified columnar. There are type of cells that are called goblet cells, and goblet cells produce mucus. That mucus will start to stick to the cilia that are at the ends of the columnar cells. Okay, let me see if I can draw something like that out for you. Okay, let's see if I can do that and show you what that looks like. Let me go to here, and let me show you, hopefully you can see my whiteboard here. And let me draw for you. Let's say here's the windpipe or the trachea. And here, and then here, these are going to be columnar cells, right? Like this. So these are columnar cells. And along the columnar cells, remember sometimes we have these little hairs that come off of it. So these are going to be cilia. So now we have ciliated columnar epithelium. Okay, you get the gist of what I'm trying to draw here. And then here, let's see if I can change this. We'll make this, let's make it red here. So right here, we have a goblet cell. And then over here, we have a goblet cell. These are goblet cells. And what goblet cells do is goblet cells are going to secrete mucus. So it's going to release the mucus, and it's going to stick here. And it's going to release the mucus, and it's going to stick here. So now as the person is inhaling and breathing in air in this direction, the dust particles should stick here to the mucus. And if it does, that's great, because then you can go and cough it up and beat it out this way. We also need those cilia that we saw at the ends here, and all of these cilia are supposed to beat rhythmically superior. Smoking is what actually destroys the cilia. And then if it's destroyed, all the chemicals and particles make it down into the deeper part of the respiratory tract, right, into the lungs and alveoli. Not good, okay? So there's a little bit of practical application to the pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium. Okay, let's go back to our PowerPoint. Hopefully you can see my PowerPoint. If you don't, I'm sure someone will tell me. So the PowerPoint is up here. And so we covered this pseudostratified columnar. Now we understand the concept of mucus and how it moves and traps debris. And then we're left with transitional epithelium. Well, that accommodates distension and relaxation with changes in the organ volume. That was with the urinary bladder example that I gave you. Okay, so we're done with epithelium. Let's look at connective tissue. Now, connective tissue, what was the big difference when we compared epithelium to connective? I said connective tissue is where we have widely spaced cells that are separated by lots of matrix, where epithelium was different. Epithelium was lots of cells closely packed together with little extracellular matrix. Connective tissue is widely spaced cells separated by lots of protein fibers and ground substance, and together we call that matrix or extracellular matrix. Extracellular means outside of the cell. Connective tissue is the most abundant and the variable type of tissue that we find in the body, and it's got a lot of important functions. It helps to connect organs to each other. Connective tissue connects organs to each other. It even connects the epithelium to the rest of the body. It's involved with protection, especially when we talk about physical function and immune function. When I think of immunity, I'm thinking about white blood cells and antibodies, right? So when we talk about blood, believe it or not, blood is connective tissue. It's just considered liquid connective tissue, right? It's not solid like maybe bone, or solid like muscles and tendons and ligaments, which are all connective tissue. Storage of energy and heat production, adipose. So adipose or adipocytes, adipose refers to fat cells. Fat cells store energy. Stored energy is what we call triglycerides. It's nothing other than sugar stored in a fat cell. We call them. Exercise is the way of lowering triglycerides, because that helps to get the sugar out of fat cells and burns that up for fuel, for energy. Adipose is actually metabolically active. We'll talk about it a little bit when we talk about the endocrine system, because adipose and fat cells release chemical messages. They release chemical messages called cytokines, meaning they could take any type of inflammatory disease and make it worse. So obesity can make osteoporosis worse. It can make cancers worse, MS, Parkinson's, rheumatoid arthritis, IBS, Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, any type of inflammatory condition. And most diseases within the United States are categorized as inflammatory diseases. Additional adipose or fat will make those things worse because of the inflammatory cytokines and messages that they send out. Where have we heard the word cytokines before? We've heard it around the pandemic with COVID-19. We've heard it with people having an unchecked and unregulated cytokine storm, right? A cytokine storm is what happens in unhealthy individuals where there's no regulation of the cytokines, where we're supposed to have these negative feedback loops in place where if something gets out of control, the body should be able to dampen it. But in unbalanced, unhealthy individuals with metabolic issues, they don't have that check mechanism in place. Connective tissue is also used for movement and transport because of blood. Blood, as I said, is liquid connective tissue. Now let's look at some of the categories here. I'm gonna zoom ahead and then I'm gonna come back, but just want you to see under connective tissue we have loose connective tissue, right? CT is connective tissue. So we have loose connective tissue proper. We have dense connective tissue proper. We have fluid connective tissue, blood and lymph. We have supporting connective tissue, like cartilage and bone. Okay, so let's go back and I'll cover some of these topics again. So under loose connective tissue, right, if there's loose connective tissue, then we have dense connective tissue. So let's compare these two. Loose connective tissue, we have areolar connective tissue, adipose, and reticular. Areolar is kind of important because it's the layer that separates your skin from the deeper muscle, the deeper tissues underneath. So if you were to pinch your forearm, you can pinch and pull away your skin, but you're not pinching your muscle. And that's due to the areolar layer. There's lots of elastic and collagen fibers that are there. Elastic sounds like a rubber band, right? It has elasticity. It can be distorted, but bounce back to its shape. And then collagen is a type of elastin is a protein, and so is collagen. Collagen's another protein, but it kind of is involved with the rigidity or firmness and strength of the tissue. And many tissues have elastic protein and collagen protein. Collagen we have in the skin, we have it in the hair, we have it in the nails, we have it in muscles and tendons and ligaments, as we do elastic. It's just a matter of what ratio of each do we have. Adipose, we said, are fat cells. Fat cells, we said, are metabolically active. They release cytokines. They're also involved in secreting estrogen. And that's why, especially with women that may have eating disorders and their level of body fat goes down, they could become, they get amenorrhea, which is no menstrual cycle, due to the estrogen imbalance that's there. Adipose is really important for men and women because it stores toxins as well, which makes us look at obesity in a very different light, not so much as an eating disorder per se, but maybe that individual is in a toxic environment, and to save themselves, to save them from the damage, it needs a place to store the toxins. So they put that toxin in fat cells so that it doesn't go to the nervous system and kill itself, right? This is what happens with insects. If you think of, let's say, pesticides and fungicides and herbicides, right? These farmers spray these herbicides and pesticides and toxins on their crops, and then when insects consume that, what happens to the insects? They die. Why do they die? Well, have you ever seen a morbidly obese spider? No, because they don't have fat cells, right? So that means that when they consume the toxin, it goes right to its nervous system and kills it. We as humans, however, we have fat cells. So when we're exposed to these toxins, it's stored in the fat cells, and little bits at a time, it can release them at a rate or a pace in which the liver hopefully can handle that and break it down. And then it sends it to the kidneys where hopefully we can excrete them. If not, then it sends it back into circulation and it goes back to the liver. And each time something goes to the liver to detoxify it, it creates a lot of free radicals and a lot of what we call reactive oxygen species, which are damaging to our DNA. So to quench the reactive oxygen species or oxidants, we can consume antioxidants, right? That's what tries to neutralize all of the oxidants that we may be consuming. Reticular is also loose connective tissue. That just helps to make the framework of many of the organs in the body. So that was loose connective tissue. When we look at dense connective tissue, we have dense regular and dense irregular. Dense regular connective tissue is found in tendons and ligaments, and they are densely packed collagen fibers. They are interwoven very tightly packed together. So it looks very regular under a microscope, whereas dense, irregular, now we have these collagen fibers that are interwoven, not in parallel organized fashion, but very disorganized. So we can find them in the dermis. And then elastic connective tissue, we find these with certain ligaments for elasticity. Let's say we looked at ligaments of the vertebral column. When we looked at the spine is made up of 24 freely movable vertebrae, 7 in the cervical spine, 12 in the thoracic spine, 5 in the lumbar spine. So we have 24 altogether. But the way that the vertebrae are interlocked with one another, they're pretty stable. And because of their stability, right, if you think of the spine, it's stable and it's very flexible. So to help add to the flexibility of what is already stable from a bony perspective, we need ligaments to add to that flexibility, so it's going to have a lot of elastic connective tissue. But if we look at the ligaments of, let's say, the knee joint is very unstable. It's very flexible, but it's also very unstable. So we need a lot of collagen. You lost me?
The picture.
Okay, hold on. I'll get back. Thank you.
All right.
Can you see me? It says that it's being shared. Let me unshare it. Let's see what happens. And let's go back to share again.
Nothing.
Better?
Nothing.
Nothing.
Hold on.
Nothing.
Okay, do you see me now?
No.
Negative.
No.
Okay. It says we're connected at my end. Can you see my whiteboard?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, so you can see my whiteboard. Okay, can you see this?
No.
Oh boy.
No. Somebody's snoring.
Yeah, someone fell asleep on us.
No,
My
I'm sorry. That's my husband.
God. Oh, you know what? Let's see. I am going to, let me stop this recording. Let me log out and then I'll log back in and hopefully that will fix the problem, okay? So let's see. Let's see if that will fix it. So let's stop this recording.